good reading week. So this week we're going to be continuing to think about causation, picking up from the last lecture before reading week. And actually, this week's topic joins together thinking about causation with another topic from earlier in term, namely the topic on possible worlds and modality. Specifically because this week we're going to consider so-called counterfactual theories of causation. So, as we saw, counterfactuals concern what might have happened or what would have happened, and are analysed by people like Lewis in terms of what happens in possible worlds that are not our actual world. So that'll be our topic for this week. I'll just switch to the slides and full screen them. So counterfactual analyses of causation is our topic for this week. Probably the most popular approach to causation these days. And we're going to specifically examine what's sort of the classical statement of a counterfactual analysis of causation, namely the one given by David Lewis, who obviously is familiar to you from our examination of the notion of possible worlds. So Lewis was partly interested in causation because of his interest in possible worlds and vice versa. Okay, so we'll pick up just using the example from Mackey, so you can maybe see a bit more clearly how Lewis's account differs from Mackey's, and we'll come on to a comparison later in the lecture. But so Mackey's example was of the short circuit causing a fire. Mackey's claim was that the short circuit is what he called an Inus condition for the fire, and that was what qualified it as a cause of the fire. Lewis says something a little bit different, namely that the reason the short circuit counts as cause of a fire is because the fire counterfactually depends upon the short circuit. What does he mean when he says it counterfactually depends? Well, Lewis understands counterfactual dependence in terms of a pair of counterfactual conditionals or subjunctive conditionals. So subjunctive conditionals are conditionals of the form, if X had happened, then Y would have happened. So note the would. That's characteristic of subjunctive conditionals, which differs from something like a material conditional or an indicative conditional that you might have come across in, for instance, studying first-order logic. So those just tend to be plain if-then statements. If it rains, I get wet. The subjunctive it normally involves a would or a might. If this had happened, then that would have happened. If this had happened, then that might have happened, which is sort of what leads us to think that they have something to do with possible worlds, ways things might have been, besides the actual way things are. And they can't be understood. The semantics is much more complicated than the semantics that you might have already studied for the material conditional, which for those of you who did first-order logic, the material conditional can be understood just in terms of a truth table. When it comes to counterfactual conditional, as I say, things are more complex, and we'll see how they might be understood in terms of possible worlds. Anyway, so I guess I sort of flip between talking about subjunctive conditionals and counterfactual conditionals, and that's because Lewis does the same thing. So what he means by a counterfactual conditional is just a subjunctive conditional. Okay, and another thing to note is that Lewis, when he talks about counterfactual dependence, he sometimes actually uses the phrase causal dependence. When he talks about a relation between propositions, he talks about counterfactual dependence. When he talks about a relation between events, he talks about causal dependence. I'm just going to use the phrase counterfactual dependence because actually that's what most people now do. They just talk about counterfactual dependence between events, which is easily understood in terms of the associated propositions, as we'll see. So, okay, so that's just a sort of an aside or a little bit of a tangent, but the key point is that Lewis is going to understand the counterfactual dependence of the fire on the short circuit in terms of a pair of counterfactuals or subjunctive conditionals. So the first one says if the short circuit had occurred, then the fire would have occurred. And the second one says if the short circuit hadn't occurred, then the fire wouldn't have occurred, right? Okay, so if the short circuit had occurred, the fire would have occurred. If the short circuit hadn't occurred, then the fire wouldn't have occurred. So that's what it is for the fire, according to Lewis, for the fire to counterfactually depend upon the short circuit. Now, suppose that in the real world, in the actual world, both the short circuit and the fire occur, then counterfactual 1, the antecedent of that, the bit that says if S had occurred, well, it's actually true because S did occur. So you might think it's slightly odd that Lewis should call 1 a counterfactual because it doesn't say anything contrary to fact. It says if S had occurred and S did occur. But I guess just for simplicity, Lewis just calls all subjunctives counterfactuals, whether or not their antecedents are true or false. Now, for Lewis, actually, we can basically ignore the first counterfactual. And the reason is because he thinks that if the short circuit and the fire actually occurred, and of course they must actually occur if this is to be a case of causation in the real world, because you can't have causation between two events if one or the other doesn't actually occur. So both the short circuit and the fire must occur if they're to be candidate cause and effect. But because they actually occur, Lewis just takes the first subjunctive or counterfactual conditional to be automatically true. And we'll see why in a minute. But basically, if S had occurred, then F would have occurred is automatically true if both S and F did indeed occur. So basically, everything hangs upon the second of the two counterfactuals, the one about what would have happened if S hadn't happened. So if S hadn't happened, then F wouldn't have happened. That's the crucial one that's going to test for causation. And interestingly, this is basically the same as the standard test for causation in the law. So lawyers apply the so-called but-for test for causation. So but for the short circuit, would the fire have occurred? If the answer is that but for the short circuit, the fire wouldn't have occurred, then we designate the short circuit a cause of the fire in standard legal practice. So basically, the standard law test for causation is just a simple counterfactual test. Okay, so we can just formalize this a bit. If S stands for the short circuit, the event of the short circuit occurring, and F stands for the fire, the event of the fire, then we can use this notation, O brackets S, to stand for the proposition or the sentence the short circuit occurred. So S is the event of the short circuit. O brackets S just says that this event occurred. It's just a proposition or a sentence saying the short circuit occurred. Likewise for OF, O brackets F, F just stands for the fire, and O brackets F is just the sentence that the fire in fact occurred. So adopting this formalism, we also adopt a specific notation to denote the counterfactual connective, the counterfactual conditional, and that's the box arrow notation. So if A, then it would have been that B would be denoted A box arrow B. So those of you who have done first order logic will note that this notation is different from the notation that we use for the material conditional. Actually, various pieces of formalism are used to designate the material conditional, sometimes just an arrow with no box. So that's just to reflect the fact that these are two different types of conditional to be understood in two different ways. Okay, so OS box arrow OF just formalizes the first of our two counterfactuals. It's to be read if the short circuit had occurred, then the fire would have occurred. On the other hand, negation OS box arrow negation OF. So the negation symbol is just to be read not. So 2 effectively says if the short circuit had not occurred, then the fire wouldn't have occurred. So that's just formalizing our English language counterfactual, which we have on the previous slide. Okay, so you might think, well, okay, so we've got our sort of simple understanding of causation in terms of counterfactuals. Maybe it seems somewhat plausible. It corresponds to the way that lawyers test for causation. Obviously, as I think I said in the last lecture, lawyers are pretty interested in causation because, a lot of crimes, in order to find someone guilty, you have to establish that their act caused a certain harm. For instance, murder. If someone were to be convicted of murder, we'd at least have to establish that their act caused someone's death. We might have to establish more than that, but we at least need to establish that. So the but-for test, the kind of simple counterfactual test, corresponds fairly straightforwardly to this test in the law. So maybe it's got some plausibility about it. We'll actually come back to some problems for it, and what we'll find is that even Lewis, the advocate of a counterfactual, a kind of causation, doesn't defend such a simple one as the one that we've so far suggested, the simple but-for test for causation. We'll see that his final account is a little bit more complex than that. But anyway, so, okay, maybe there's some connection between causation and counterfactuals, but you might be thinking, well, counterfactuals are a bit of a puzzle, so what makes them true or false? And that's going to be key in assessing whether the counterfactual analysis of causation is any good, right? So if it, in order for it to be plausible, it's got to be that generally, I suppose, effects do counterfactually depend upon their causes. And if we're to establish what counterfactually depends upon what, then we're going to need to know what makes certain counterfactuals true. Now, as we've already suggested, both this week and in previous weeks, a popular approach to understanding counterfactuals, indeed the most popular approach, is to think about them in terms of possible worlds. So this was a topic from earlier in term. So I guess the sort of standard semantics or truth conditions for the counterfactual is the Lewis-Stolnaker one. And so, I mean, obviously David Lewis, as the name suggests, David Lewis was one of the key, contributors to the development of this semantics. This says that a counterfactual, if A had occurred, then B would have... I should just say, if A, then B. We're not... A and B don't have to be about the occurrence of events, although they can be. But counterfactual, if it had been that A, then it would have been that B is true if and only if B is true in all the closest worlds in which A is true. So the idea is that in assessing the counterfactual, if it had been that A, then it would have been that B. We've got to look at the closest A worlds, the closest worlds to our own where A holds, and see if B also holds there. And if it does, if B does hold at all the closest A worlds to the actual world, then that counterfactual is going to be true. what does it mean to talk about close worlds? I mean, it's not like they're literally related in some space, right? We've seen, especially for Lewis, via his thesis of isolation, it's not as though worlds inhabit the same space time or anything like that. So the talk of closeness is metaphorical, and it's to be understood, according to Lewis and Stolnicker, in terms of similarity, right? So what the semantics really says is that the counterfactual, if it had been that A, then it would have been that B, is true if and only if B is true in all of the worlds where A obtains that are most similar to our own, right? So there might be some maybe distant or dissimilar worlds in which A is true but B isn't. But that's okay, provided the closest worlds where A is true are worlds where B is true. So, I suppose you could illustrate with respect to the short circuit and the fire. So it could be that the fire occurs in all of the most similar worlds to our own in which the short circuit occurs. And that would be enough to make the counterfactual true, even if there are some worlds where the short circuit occurs, but the fire doesn't occur, provided those worlds are sort of suitably dissimilar, right? So it might be that, there are some possible worlds in which the short circuit occurs, but, aliens come at just the right moment from outer space to douse out the fire before it gets going, right? So that would be a world in which the short circuit occurs, but the fire doesn't. But obviously, it looks like it's a world that's quite unlike our actual world. So we'll talk more about this as we go on. Okay, so Lewis endorses a principle when it comes to talking about the similarity of possible worlds, a principle that he calls strong centering. And this says that the actual world is more similar to itself than any other world is to it. So there's no world that's as much like the actual world as the actual world is. And basically, it's this principle of strong centering that means that if both the short circuit and the fire do occur, then that first counterfactual that says if the short circuit had occurred, then the fire would have occurred, is automatically true. So suppose that the short circuit and the fire do occur, then the closest world to the actual world in which the short circuit occurs is, of course, the actual world by strong centering. So the nearest or closest or most similar world to the actual world in which the short circuit occurs just is the actual world, because the short circuit occurs in the actual world. So in order to evaluate that first counterfactual, we've just got to look at the actual world, given that we know it's a short circuit world and it's the unique closest or most similar short circuit world, and just check out whether the fire also occurs in that world. In which case, that is to say, it will occur in the most similar short circuit world, namely the actual world. And so, if the fire also happens in the actual world, then the first counterfactual just comes out true on the Lewis-Stolnicker semantics. Okay, so but things are a bit trickier when it comes to the second counterfactual, the one that says if the short circuit hadn't occurred, then the fire wouldn't have occurred. And that's because, in fact, the short circuit does occur and the fire does occur. So we're going to have to look at some other worlds in order to, I say look, I mean kind of metaphorically look, because we can't literally look at them, but we're going to have to consider them in order to determine whether that counterfactual is true on the Lewis-Stolnicker semantics. Now, Lewis advances a particular thesis about what the most similar worlds in which the short circuit doesn't occur are going to be like. And basically, his argument for this is quite long and complex. And we're not going to go through it. We wouldn't have time to go through it in the lecture. So we're just going to present what the upshot is. If you're interested in the sort of long, complex argument for why Lewis thinks that the most similar worlds in which a short circuit doesn't occur are, as we're about to describe, then he has a paper called Counterfactual Dependence and Time's Arrow, which is on the further reading list for this week's topic. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that. So anyway, the upshot of that paper is that the closest world, according to Lewis, or the closest worlds to the actual world in which the short circuit doesn't occur, are worlds in which basically the whole of history is the same as in the actual world until just before the time when the short circuit occurs in the actual world. So if the short circuit occurs in the actual world, or if it occurred in the actual world at noon yesterday, then the idea is that the closest worlds in which a short circuit doesn't occur aren't going to deviate from the actual world. They're going to be just like the actual world right up until just before noon yesterday. But then, of course, they're going to have to diverge a bit, because in the actual world the short circuit occurred, but in these worlds, these are meant to be worlds in which the short circuit doesn't occur. So we need a small deviation. Lewis sometimes calls this a miracle, although maybe it's slightly unfortunate terminology because it sounds like something supernatural. Lewis doesn't really have anything supernatural in mind. His idea is just that, things just differ in these worlds. Maybe because the laws are slightly different, or maybe the just as a matter of probability or something. But anyway, somehow, and Lewis talks more about this in the article I just mentioned, some small deviation occurs, say shortly before noon yesterday, that prevents the short circuit from occurring. Moreover, according to Lewis, these most similar worlds to ours in which a short circuit doesn't occur are going to be ones in which not only is history the same until just before noon yesterday, but also, apart from this little deviation that you get that allows the short circuit not to occur, basically the laws of nature are obeyed, the same laws as hold in our world. So in particular, the same laws are going to prevail for all times after noon yesterday. So, laws that ensure, for instance, that fires don't just spontaneously happen out of nothing. So the idea is that in such a world, it's presumably going to be the case that the fire doesn't occur, right? So it's very like our actual world, just a little deviation that allows the short circuit not to occur. Lewis's idea is that because basically the same laws are in operation, apart from whatever allows this little deviation that prevents a short circuit from occurring, then, of course, because, you wouldn't normally get fires without short circuits in the actual world, you don't get a fire without the short circuit in these most similar worlds in which the short circuit doesn't occur. So that's basically the upshot of a complicated story that Lewis tells, so he's arguing essentially that counterfactual, if the short circuit hadn't occurred, then the fire wouldn't have occurred, is true, and so the fire counterfactually depends upon the short circuit, and so the short circuit is a cause of the fire. Okay. Now, I said that Lewis's own analysis of causation isn't as simple as the but-for test for causation. It's not a simple counterfactual analysis. It's a little bit more complicated. So what Lewis wants to say is that counterfactual dependence is sufficient for causation, but not necessary, right? So specifically, he wants to say, well, if C and E are actual events and E counterfactually depends upon C, then C is a cause of E. So if there is counterfactual dependence, then you've got causation. But he doesn't want to say the converse. He doesn't want to say that if there's no counterfactual dependence, then you definitely don't have causation, right? So he thinks there's some circumstances in which you can get causation without counterfactual dependence, even though in every case where you do have counterfactual dependence, you have causation. And what worries him, particularly, are cases of a sort that we considered in the last lecture, namely preemption cases. Preemption cases we actually saw posed a problem for the Inus account of causation, and they also pose a problem, or at least an initial problem, for the counterfactual approach, but a problem that Lewis argues can be solved. So here's an example. A and B, Alice and Bob, are stalking a deer. Only one is going to have the chance to shoot. So the idea is, for instance, even if, so whoever shoots first, well, they might hit and kill a deer, but they might miss. If they miss, then the sound of the shot's going to scare the deer off, so the other one won't get a chance to shoot. Okay, so suppose that Alice shoots and kills a deer. So seems fairly clear that Alice's shot is a cause of the deer's death. But the deer's death doesn't, it seems, counterfactually depend upon Alice's shot, because if Alice hadn't shot, Bob would have shot and killed the deer. We'll suppose, for the sake of argument, that Bob's a great shot, so there's no question that he would have shot and killed the deer had Alice not done so. So here you have apparent causation. Alice's shot does seem to be a cause of the deer's death, even though the deer's death doesn't counterfactually depend upon Alice's shot, because if Alice hadn't shot, Bob would have shot and killed the deer. So Lewis is cognizant of these sorts of examples, and so that's why he says it's not true that if you don't have counterfactual dependence, then automatically you don't have causation. So what he wants to do, actually, and we'll see how this works in a minute with respect to the deer example, is he wants to define causation not in terms of simple counterfactual dependence, but in terms of a chain of counterfactual dependence. So what's a causal chain, as he calls it, or a chain of counterfactual dependence? Well, basically it's just a sequence of events such that each event in the sequence counterfactually depends upon the previous one in the sequence. So formally we've got on the slide, so we've got a sequence of events C, D1, D2, D3, etc., all the way to E, such that E counterfactually depends upon Dn, which counterfactually depends upon Dn minus 1, which counterfactually depends upon Dn minus 2, and so on, all the way till we get back to C. So causal chain is just that. It's just a sequence of events such that each event in the sequence counterfactually depends upon the previous one in the sequence. And so basically the idea then, of course, is going to be, well, if E counterfactually depends upon Dn, then we can conclude that Dn is a cause of E, because counterfactual dependence is sufficient for causation, even if it's not necessary. And likewise, we can infer that Dn counterfactually depends upon Dn minus 1, and therefore Dn minus 1 causes Dn. We can infer that D1 counterfactually depends upon C, and so C causes D1. So we've got this sort of causal chain corresponding to our chain of counterfactual dependence. Now, Lewis claims that causation is transitive, right? What does that mean? Well, I guess we considered what a transitive relation was when we talked about identity earlier in term. In the case of causation, to say that causation is transitive is to say that if X causes Y and Y causes Z, then X causes Z, right? So Lewis thinks that's a platitude, a truism about causation. So basically what that means, if causation is transitive, then we can infer that if there's a causal chain connecting C and E, then C is a cause of E, right? Because E counterfactually depends upon Dn, which means that dn causes E, and dn counterfactually depends upon dn minus 1, which means that dn minus 1 causes dn. But if dn minus 1 causes dn and dn causes E, then it follows by transitivity that dn minus 1 causes E. And so we can continue to compound that sort of reasoning all the way till we get back to C in order to establish that via the transitivity of causation, if this is a causal chain, then C must be a cause of E. Okay, so we're still yet to apply this to the Deer case and show how it helps, but just bear with me a moment. So what Lewis's official analysis of causation then is going to be is that C is a cause of E, where C and E are actual events. I should say distinct actual events, right? Slight digression here. The reason we require them to be distinct is because some cases where you get counterfactual dependence between events that aren't distinct, then you don't have genuine causation, right? So an example that Jae-Gwon Kim gives that you might come across in your reading is suppose that I write the name Larry down on a piece of paper. Now consider the event of my writing 2 R's down on the piece of paper. Then what Kim says is that my writing Larry counterfactually depends upon my writing 2 R's on the piece of paper, because the 2 R's are part of the name Larry, so I can't write the name Larry down without writing the 2 R's down, right? So my writing Larry counterfactually depends upon my writing the double R. But Kim says that it would be a bit weird to say that my writing the 2 R's causes me to write the name Larry. It's not really a causal relationship because the 2 R's are just part of the event of writing Larry down. So that's why Lewis would require that C and E be distinct events, right? Because it's only when we have distinct events that counterfactual dependence is relevant to causation. My writing 2 R's and my writing Larry are not distinct events. One's sort of part of the other event. Okay, so C is a cause of E if C and E are distinct actual events, and there's a causal chain from C to E. A chain, in other words, of counterfactual dependence from C to E. Now, some cases you do have just straightforward counterfactual dependence of E on C, so maybe the fire just straightforwardly counterfactually depends upon the short circuit. That's okay, according to Lewis, because where E just straightforwardly counterfactually depends upon C, this can still be considered a causal chain, but it's just a causal chain that only has one link. Okay, so how does this all help with preemption? So, as we saw, Alice shoots, and plausibly her shot is the cause of the deer's death, but we don't have counterfactual dependence. The deer's death doesn't counterfactually depend upon Alice's shot, because if Alice hadn't shot, then Bob would have shot and killed the deer. But Lewis says, well, okay, fine, the deer's death doesn't counterfactually depend upon Alice's shot, but there is, he says, a causal chain connecting Alice's shot to the deer's death, and in virtue of that fact, Alice's shot is a cause of the deer's death by his analysis. So let's just think about this. In order to see this, it's sort of helpful to think a bit about the causal structure of the case first. So we could let small a designate the event of A shooting, small b designate the event of Bob shooting. Remember that Bob shooting doesn't happen in this scenario. Bob would have shot, but he doesn't. So B is a non-actual event. It's a merely possible event. Small d represents an actual event, the deer's death. And small m, we'll see why we appeal to this in a minute. Small m could be considered to be the event of A's bullet passing some point midway between Alice and the deer. We'll see why we invoke this event in a minute. So the structure looks something like this. We've got Alice's shot, so this causes the presence of a speeding bullet midair between Alice and the deer. At least Lewis is going to say this. which in turn causes the deer's death. So these sort of solid arrows are representing causal relationships, which sort of thinking intuitively about the case. And then, but not only does Alice's death cause some events like M and maybe D, we'll get back to that, but it also prevents something else from happening. It prevents Bob from shooting, right? So this sort of arrow with the inverted arrowhead is supposed to be representing a relation of prevention, right? So Alice's shot prevents Bob from shooting. And then the dotted arrow is just representing the fact that if it had happened, so Bob's shooting doesn't happen, but if it had happened, then it would have brought about the deer's death, right? So there's a sense in which one way of thinking about this case is that Alice kind of initiates a process that does bring about the deer's death that goes via the bullet traveling from her gun to the deer. But it also kind of separately prevents something that would have caused the deer's death, right? Prevents Bob from shooting. So it has these two sort of influences, if you like. One that's kind of conducive to the deer's death and one that's sort of not conducive. Anyway, so basically the reason Lewis appeals to this event M is that he thinks that it kind of completes a causal chain from A to D. And it's in virtue of the causal chain that Alice's shot counts as a cause of the deer's death, even though the deer's death doesn't counterfactually depend upon Alice's shot. So how do we see this? So I think sort of the one connection is fairly straightforward. So what's fairly straightforward is that M counterfactually depends upon Alice's shooting. So M, if you remember, represents the presence of a speeding bullet midair between Alice and the deer. So the thought is, well, if Alice hadn't shot, then there wouldn't have been a speeding bullet midair between Alice and the deer, right? There might have been a speeding bullet midair between Bob and the deer, because in that case Bob would have shot, but there wouldn't have been a speeding bullet midair between Alice and the deer. So fairly straightforwardly, M counterfactually depends upon A. So A is a cause of M. That's just a one-link causal chain. So what Lewis would like to establish is that D counterfactually depends upon M, because then we'd have a two-link causal chain from A to D, and so we could get the desired result that Alice's action was a cause of the deer's death. Right, now this second counterfactual dependence, the dependence of D upon M, is slightly less straightforward to see, but Lewis argues that it nevertheless obtains, right? So the relevant counterfactual is if there hadn't been a bullet speeding midair between Alice and the deer, then the deer wouldn't have died. Now you might think, hold on a minute. If there hadn't been a speeding bullet midair between Alice and the deer, then presumably that would have had to have been because Alice didn't shoot. But if Alice didn't shoot, then Bob would have shot, and so the deer would have died. So you might think that invalidates the claim that if there hadn't been a speeding bullet midair between Alice and the deer, then the deer wouldn't have died. Now, basically, and again, this sort of appeals to Lewis's long story about counterfactual semantics that's developed in his paper Counterfactual Dependence and Times Arrow on the further reading list. But Lewis is going to resist that, right? So he's going to say that the reasoning that leads you to think if the speeding bullet hadn't been midair between Alice and the deer, then that would have had to have been because Alice didn't earlier shoot. That's illegitimate reasoning. He calls it backtracking reasoning, and he thinks it's illegitimate. So what we're doing is we're sort of reasoning backwards in time. So we're saying, well, if M hadn't happened, then that would have had to have been because earlier A didn't happen. And he thinks that's illegitimate. And basically this comes out, or this connects with what I said earlier. So Lewis's idea is that the nearest world in which M doesn't occur is one that's exactly like the actual world until just before the occurrence of M. So it's a world in which Alice still shoots. And in such a world where Alice still shoots, of course, the noise is enough. Well, either the deer will die, or even if she somehow misses, then the noise would be enough to scare the deer off. So as soon as Alice shoots, then it's kind of baked in that Bob doesn't shoot, right? So when we reason about what would have happened if the bullet hadn't been there midair between Alice and the deer, then the nearest world in which that happens is one in which Alice still shoots, and so Bob won't get a chance. And in such a world where Alice shoots, well, the bullet had better be there midair between Alice and the deer, otherwise the deer's not going to die. That's the thought. If the bullet, a world in which Alice doesn't shoot, a world in which Alice shoots, but the bullet isn't there midair between her and the deer is maybe one in which she shoots off target, for instance. And then the deer doesn't die, right? So the bullet isn't there midair between Alice and the deer. It's midair between Alice and a tree that's in the other direction or something. And so the deer doesn't die. So that's Lewis's reasoning. So he thinks that, yes, indeed, the deer's death does counterfactually depend upon the presence of this bullet midair between Alice and the deer. The presence of the bullet midair between Alice and the deer counterfactually depends upon Alice's shooting. So what we have is a two-link chain of counterfactual dependence, or chain of causation, and so Alice's shot is, after all, a cause of the deer's death, even though there's no direct counterfactual dependence of the deer's death on Alice's shot. Okay, so slightly convoluted reasoning, I suppose, that leads Lewis to this conclusion, but this is reasoning that he defends. So so if it works out, then great, because preemption cases are a bit tricky, and we've seen that we saw last week that regularity theories have some difficulties dealing with preemption cases. So just to recap that, with reference to the example that we've just given, suppose Bob is a perfectly reliable shot. Then we've got the issue that basically Bob's intention to shoot, if Alice doesn't, is going to count as an Inus condition of the deer's death. So the fact that Bob intends to shoot if Alice doesn't, and he's a perfectly good shot, perfectly reliable shot, that's basically enough already to guarantee that the deer's going to die one way or the other. It's sufficient, in other words, for the deer's death. Because it means that the deer's definitely going to die one way or the other. Either Alice will shoot and kill it, or Bob will shoot and kill it. So the worry is that Bob's shot is going to count as an Inus condition. It's part of a set, which maybe includes the Bob's being a very good shot, the weather conditions being good, and so on. That is itself sufficient for the deer's death. So the Inus account potentially is going to generate the wrong result about this. Okay, so you might say, well, is Bob's intention does it really guarantee the deer's death in the circumstance in which it occurs? So what about if Alice shoots but shoots off target? Then Bob won't get a chance to shoot and the deer won't die. But remember, we're sort of considering. We're considering a deterministic case, really. If we where basically the laws of nature are just such that Alice is going to shoot and kill the deer, and if Alice doesn't shoot, then Bob's definitely going to shoot and kill a deer. If we start introducing probabilities and say, well, maybe it's merely a matter of probability whether Alice hits the deer if she shoots, then the regularity account's going to have other problems, right? Because then it starts to look that like even Alice's shot isn't sufficient for the deer's death. It merely gives a certain probability for the deer's death, and that in itself is a whole problem for the regularity account. But we won't go down that probabilistic route. I think there's some reading on the further reading list concerning that. Now, we also saw, at least briefly last time, that there's potentially a problem for the regularity analysis with the direction of causation, and that's because not only do causes often turn out to be Inus conditions for their effects, but also effects are often Inus conditions of their causes, right? So the worry is that the regularity account, and particularly the Inus account, is going to imply that effects cause their causes, which at least normally they don't. So to get a sense of why, suppose that the pavement is wet, and what in fact caused the wet pavement was the rain. Suppose it happens that there's no sprinklers, like grass garden sprinklers nearby. There's no burst water mains or anything like that. We'll now take the set consisting of the wet pavement, the absence of sprinklers, the absence of a burst pipe, and so on. Putting all that together, you've got a set of conditions that guarantees that it must have earlier rained, right? So, in other words, you've got a set of conditions that's sufficient for its earlier having rained. The wet pavement is a non-redundant element of that set, so the wet pavement is an Inus condition for its earlier having rained. But we don't, of course, want to say that the wet pavement caused the rain, rather the direction of causation is the other way round. So Lewis says, okay, yeah, we've got a problem there for the regularity theory, but he thinks that his account deals with it, his counterfactual theory deals with it. And basically, again, this has to do with his idea that backtracking, what he calls backtracking counterfactuals, that reason that if later events hadn't happened, then earlier events wouldn't have happened or would have been different. He thinks that sort of reasoning is invalid. His semantics for counterfactuals is going to rule that out. So he'll say that it's false that if the pavement hadn't been wet, then the rain wouldn't have occurred. And to the extent that he's right, then his account overcomes this problem of generating the undesirable result that effects cause their causes. But again, in order to properly assess that, it's necessary to go into detail about Lewis semantics for the counterfactuals. And as I said, that's a bit beyond the scope of this lecture. Okay. Now, another problem that faces regularity theories that Lewis thinks his counterfactual theory can overcome is what we might call a problem to do with independent effects of a common cause. It's what Lewis calls the problem of epiphenomena. So a sort of classic example of this is stormy weather, so maybe rain and wind and so on, might be effects of a fall in atmospheric pressure. Also, barometers work by detecting atmospheric pressure, right? So barometers are prediction devices. They're supposed to predict what the weather will be like. The way in which they do that is they're sensitive to atmospheric pressure, and because the weather depends upon what the atmospheric pressure is, then they can predict for you, hopefully, what the weather's going to be like. So suppose that there's a fall in atmospheric pressure, call this event little a. Suppose that small b denotes the barometer reading. Maybe the barometer saying there's going to be rain or a storm. And then small s denotes the event of the storm occurring. So the causal structure is something like this. So the atmospheric pressure falls. It causes the barometer reading because the barometer is sensitive to the atmospheric pressure. Independently, the atmospheric pressure causes the storm. So the barometer predicts the storm because it's sensitive to this atmospheric pressure, which is also what the storm depends upon. Now, the problem for the regularity account is that the barometer reading's liable to be an minus condition for the storm. And that's because, if we take the barometer, the event of the barometer saying there's going to be a storm, together with the fact, say, that the barometer is in perfect working order, then the worry is that jointly that's going to be a set of conditions that's sufficient for the storm, in the regularity sense, that whenever you have a perfectly working barometer that says there's going to be a storm, then there's a storm. So the barometer reading is a non-redundant element of that set. Just because you have a perfectly working barometer doesn't mean there's going to be a storm. It's also necessary that that perfectly working barometer says there's going to be a storm. So the worry is that the barometer reading, the barometer saying there's going to be a storm, is going to come out as an minus condition of the storm. But of course, the barometer reading doesn't cause the storm, right? That'd be kind of magic if it did that. It predicts it, but it doesn't cause it. The atmospheric pressure is what causes the storm, and also causes the barometer reading. Now, so looks like the INIS account has problems with this. And Lewis is going to say that his counterfactual analysis can avoid this. And again, that's going to rely on is this idea that backtracking counterfactuals come out false, right? So what he's going to say is that, it's true that if the atmospheric pressure hadn't fallen, then the barometer later wouldn't have said that there was going to be a storm. And that corresponds to the fact that the atmospheric pressure causes the barometer reading. Second, he's going to say, well, the atmospheric pressure causes a storm because it's true that if the atmospheric pressure hadn't fallen, then there wouldn't have later been a storm. So that's all fine. But what he's going to deny is that his account indicates that the barometer reading caused the storm. In particular, he's going to deny the corresponding counterfactual. He's going to say that it's not the case that if the barometer reading hadn't said there was going to be a storm, then there wouldn't have been a storm. And basically he's going to deny that because he's going to say that, well, it would be illegitimate to reason that if the barometer reading hadn't said there was going to be a storm, that would have been because the atmospheric pressure earlier wouldn't fall. That would be backtracking reasoning. If we reasoned, and that's the reasoning that threatens to validate that counterfactual. So if we thought, well, if the barometer reading hadn't said there was going to be a storm, that would have been because earlier there wasn't a fall in atmospheric pressure, and so there wouldn't have been a storm. That's illegitimate because we reason backwards from the barometer latent, not saying there's going to be a storm, to the earlier non-fall in atmospheric pressure. And Lewis is going to say, actually, the closest world in which the barometer reading doesn't say there's going to be a storm is one in which past history is just the same as the actual world, including the fall in atmospheric pressure, but just there's a malfunction or something in the barometer, which means that it says it's going to be sunny. But of course, in a world in which the atmospheric pressure falls, but the barometer malfunctions, the storm still occurs, right? So Lewis is going to deny that the storm counterfactually depends upon the barometer reading, and therefore is going to deny that his analysis counts the barometer reading as a cause of the storm. And so he claims this is an advantage of his account versus the regularity account. Okay, but finally, there are still problems, some problems for the counterfactual account, even if. So, I mean, I guess one sort of thing that we've seen is that quite a lot depends upon Lewis's long story about the truth conditions for counterfactuals. Um, and so, one kind of question is whether his semantics for counterfactuals, the one that he describes in this paper, counterfactual dependence and times arrow, whether that's a correct semantics, whether that gives the results that we want. Because if it doesn't, then we've got this worry that maybe we're going to get spurious results about causation, that barometer readings cause storms, and that wet pavements cause rain. So a lot depends upon his semantics being right. But even sort of independently of that, there are problems. So one is a problem that we raised also in connection with the regularity account last time. And this is the problem of overdeterminations, or symmetric overdetermination, as it's sometimes called. So imagine a scenario that's different from before, in which Alice and Bob both shoot, and their bullets pierce the deer's heart simultaneously. Now, that's a case of symmetric overdetermination. Both Alice and Bob's shot in this case are sufficient for the deer's death, and both actually do shoot, unlike in the preemption case. The deer's death doesn't counterfactually depend upon either of their shots, because if either one of them hadn't shot, then the other presumably still would have shot. And here, there's no chain of counterfactual dependence, right? So consider the bullet midair between Alice and the deer. Well, the deer's death doesn't counterfactually depend upon that in this scenario, because even if that bullet hadn't been there, then presumably there would still be a bullet midair between Bob and the deer still would have died. So it seems that there's no causal chain, nor is the counterfactual dependence connecting Alice's shot, say, to the deer's death. And exactly the same reasoning shows that there's no causal chain or relation of counterfactual dependence connecting Bob's shot to the deer's death. So it seems that Lewis's account's going to treat neither Alice nor Bob's shot as causes, but probably most people would like to say that actually both are causes and not neither. Okay. Another problem, and this is the final problem we'll present, concerns transitivity. So recall that Lewis invokes this idea that causation is transitive. If X causes Y and Y causes Z, then X causes Z. And this is really needed because it's the key to the way he deals with cases of preemption, right? It's how he gets the right results in preemption cases, by appealing to causal chains and the transitivity of causation. But people have argued that actually maybe causation isn't transitive. So consider this case. Suppose that Alice sets a trap for the deer, but this deer's intelligent, sees the trap and avoids it, and so the deer doesn't get caught. Now, it seems true that Alice's setting the trap caused the deer to see the trap. If Alice hadn't laid the trap, the deer wouldn't have seen it. And counterfactual reasoning validates that, as I just said. So if she hadn't set the trap, the deer wouldn't have seen it. So plausibly, her setting it caused the deer to see it. The deer seeing the trap plausibly caused the deer to avoid the trap and so not get caught. Obviously, the avoidance of the trap counterfactually depends upon the seeing of the trap, right? If the deer hadn't seen it, the deer wouldn't have avoided it, and so would have got caught. But we don't want to say that Alice's setting the trap causes the deer not to get caught, I take it. So we have a failure, what appears to be a failure of transitivity. Alice's setting the trap causes a deer to see it. The deer seeing it causes the deer to avoid it. But it's kind of implausible to say that Alice is setting the trap causes the deer not to get caught. So this is a problem. Maybe causation isn't transitive. Maybe examples like this show that it's not transitive. But Lewis really needs it to be transitive if his solution to the problem of preemption is going to work. So another worry for Lewis's account. Okay, so yeah, I mean, like I say, counterfactual accounts are still very popular. Um, and basically, people have tried to develop them in such a way as to avoid some of these problems or to do better in some of these cases. And there's further reading on Moodle on this topic if you're interested in looking at some of the ways people have tried to refine counterfactual accounts to avoid problems to do with transitivity and overdetermination. But that's it for this week. So I hope you have a good week, and I will. There'll be another lecture up next week when we move on to the topic of space. So the metaphysics of space. Okay, so have a good week, and I will speak to you all again next week. Bye.